name is Jake Archambault, and for the next few minutes I will be teaching you everything you need to know about building a campfire. So, first things first, why is it so important to know how to build one of these when engaging in outdoor recreation? Well, the main reason has to do with how useful they are. Campfires are vital tools as they provide the heat necessary to cook food or boil water and make them safe to consume. Not only that, but they also provide comfort and serve as a source of light during the night. But putting their usefulness aside, knowing how to properly build a fire is also a skill that can literally save your life. For example, let's say your trip is taking place in an environment where conditions are cold and wet, such as during the winter, or at high altitudes, or in a wet, temperate forest. Knowing how to build a fire in these conditions could save you from problems like discomfort, frostbite, hypothermia, or even death. And if worse comes to worse and you find yourself in an emergency situation, you can use a fire to signal your location to rescuers and get the help that you need. So, before we get started, I would like whomever is watching to just take a moment to reflect. Think about a time when you were in the outdoors, or if you're more experienced, just think back to when you were first starting out. And think about a time when you seriously needed a fire, but you didn't have enough knowledge to properly build one. I myself can provide an example from my second year of university, when I went on a 3-day backpacking trip in early November. On the second day, it had been cold and drizzling rain all day, and once we got to our campsite, we tried desperately to start a fire to warm up, but none of us in the group knew how to make a fire in the wet conditions. Luckily, our guide, who was also a professor, stepped in after watching us struggle, and eventually had a 6-foot wall of flame going within just a couple of minutes. But since then, I have taken some of the tips that our guide gave us and put them to use on other trips to gain more experience in handling fire. And the knowledge that I gained from that is what I hope to pass on through this lesson, with my objectives being to hopefully give you a better understanding in how to identify an appropriate spot to start a fire, identify the different types of kindling and the types of wood you will use when building the fire, how to structure the fire, and how to properly put the fire out when you are done with it. Now, really quickly, before I start talking about making a fire, I would like whomever is watching to do a quick thought exercise. Imagine you are out in the wilderness right now and have just arrived at a new campsite. The rest of the group has tasked you with building a fire so that they can cook dinner. Either in your head or on a piece of paper, just list all the steps that you would take in going about the fire. Consider components such as where you're going to build the fire, what will you use for kindling, how will you light it, etc. If you'd like, you can pause the video now and take a minute to do this. Alright, I think that's enough time. Now that you hopefully have a good idea as to your own fire building process, I would like you to keep this in mind throughout the lesson and identify anything that you came up with in your process that is similar to what is being presented in this lesson, as well as anything that is different. My goal here is to expand your knowledge and not give off the idea that my method is the only way there is. Instead, I want you to compare your own process to the one that I present and see if there's anything that you would like to add to yours and essentially add on to what you already know. So, with all that being said, let's get into the fire building process. The first step in making a fire is identifying the location in which it will burn. Now, the main thing you want to keep in mind here is your surroundings, as the spot that you pick should be at least 10 feet away from any trees or brush, and you need to make sure that any dry leaves, grass, twigs, or pine needles are cleared from the area before you light the fire. Another thing you want to consider when picking a spot is ensuring that it is at least 20 meters away from where you set up any tents or tarps, as a single ember from the fire can burn a hole right through the canopy or even set it ablaze. Which is why you always want to be very careful in ensuring that your fire is far enough away from where you will be sleeping. Now that we've picked out a safe spot for the fire, we can go ahead and start gathering wood. Now, one of the main things to keep in mind when doing this is to never grab anything that is alive. Meaning no cutting down trees or breaking off branches unless the tree is already dead. The firewood that you do gather should be picked up from off the ground, but be careful that anything that you do pick up isn't wet or rotting, because then it won't burn properly. With that being said, there are 3 types of firewood that we want to look out for. First of which is kindling. Kindling, if you don't already know, is used to create an initial flame that we can build up and turn into our full-sized campfire. The most commonly used form of kindling is birch bark, as it can be easily found, doesn't take much to ignite, and it burns slow and hot. Another great form of kindling that most people don't know about is something called fatwood. Fatwood occurs when the sap of a fallen pine tree hardens into the wood, creating a reddish color. The sap acts sort of like candle wax and slows down the burn time of the wood, so that even little flakes of fatwood can burn for minutes at a time, making them a great way to get a fire going. The second type of firewood to look out for is what I like to call builder wood. This involves small pieces of wood that range from small twigs to sticks about the width of 2 fingers. This wood is what the kindling will catch on fire and be used to build up the size of the flame, as well as generate the heat necessary to burn the third type of firewood, which are the main logs. The main logs are larger pieces of wood roughly the size of a forearm that will maintain the fire for as long as you are using it. Once you have gathered the amount of wood necessary to build a fire, you then want to arrange it in a way that will allow it to burn the most efficiently. Now, when doing this, you want to give the fire as little resistance as possible, so the wood you have gathered should be arranged in a way that once the kindling is lit, smaller pieces will be the first to burn, and build up the heat and coals necessary to maintain a sustainable campfire. This can be done by structuring the wood in a number of different ways, but the one that I like to use the most is called the teepee. This is when the kindling and smaller pieces of builder wood is placed in the center of the fire pit, and the larger pieces of builder wood are balanced around the kindling in a way that comes to a point over the top of the fire. As the fire burns, the larger pieces of builder wood will eventually be turned into coals and replaced with the main logs. And as you tend the fire or add more wood, you want to try and make sure that you maintain that teepee shape, as it will allow the fire to burn in the direction that it wants, which is up. Another type of structure that many people like to use when building a fire that is certainly worth mentioning is the log cabin. Like the teepee, the kindling and smaller pieces of builder wood are placed in the center, but instead of balancing the larger pieces over the top of the fire, they are instead stacked in a square formation around the kindling in a way that resembles the walls of a cabin. But regardless of whichever structure you decide to use, there are 2 main things to keep in mind in order to keep the fire going once it is lit. The first is to not smother it. You always want to make sure that the base of the fire has open access to oxygen so that it can breathe and continue to burn. The second thing you want to ensure is that whenever you're adding a piece of wood, that it is placed above the fire and not to the side of it, as this will allow the fire to burn as much of the wood as possible and eventually make for a larger and hotter fire. So long as you maintain that flow of oxygen and ensure the proper placement of the wood, you can keep the fire going for as long as you would like until you are ready to extinguish it. First thing that you want to do when putting out a fire is to spread it out within the pit, meaning that you should separate the burning pieces of wood from one another and from the hot coals so that they can no longer feed off each other's heat and keep the fire going. What this does is it prevents the fire from getting any bigger and also makes it less likely for it to relight itself after it has been extinguished. Once you have done this, you then want to starve it of oxygen so that it can no longer burn. The best way to do this is by filling a pot or bucket up with water and then dumping it over the fire. As you are doing this, you want to make sure that the water is being dispersed across the entirety of the pit and ensure that every single log and coal is completely soaked. It typically takes about 2 to 3 dumps of water to fully extinguish the fire, and you will know it is completely out once you can no longer see the glowing of the coals or hear the sizzling from the water. However, if you don't have easy access to a body of water, another thing that you can do to put the fire out is bury it in either sand, gravel, or dirt. But if you do end up doing this, then you need to be careful that whatever you use to bury the fire does not contain any more fuel that the fire can use to relight itself. So, let's recap everything that we just learned. When picking out a spot, you want to make sure that your pit is at least 10 feet away from any trees or brush and 20 meters from any tents or tarps. The 3 things to look out for when gathering firewood are kindling, builder wood, and the main logs. Regardless if you're using either the teepee or the log cabin structures, they should always be built in a way that allows the smaller pieces of wood to be the first to burn, followed by the larger pieces. In order to keep the fire going, you want to ensure that you maintain a steady flow of oxygen to the base of the fire, and whenever you add a piece of wood, it should be placed above the fire and not beside it. And finally, to put the fire out, dump water on it until you can no longer see any glowing or hear any sizzling. Either that or cover it in either sand or dirt. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video, and I sincerely hope that this video was able to expand on any knowledge that you currently have about fire building. And to whomever may be watching this, I wish you all the best in your outdoor adventures.